started actually our little village here, and his sawmill that was built some 40 or 50 years later that sawed a lot of the wood that continued to build a town around it. And I'd like to thank, first off, Moe for helping me put this together. I like to dig in the ground, but I don't know anything about technology. As it turns out, he knows very little. But he was able to put this presentation together for me, the photographic presentation. And I'd like to thank Virginia for helping me out. Virginia Lacola, she did a lot of the carrying and moving brush around and stuff, doing stuff I couldn't do. And took a lot of the photographs and acted for scale in a lot of the other ones. So, without further ado, I brought a few things up, put up on the front table here for you to look at after, if you want to come up. There's a piece of a millstone here, a piece of one of these beams or logs that washed up during the flood a couple of years ago that led us to find out a lot more about the mill, how it was constructed. There's an old photograph of an old postcard of one of the water wheels that ran the grist mill. And this piece of wood here is very interesting, and you'll understand why when you get a good look at it later on. You're not going to get in the way, are you?
No. It just goes off after a while. Go ahead.
Did I talk to you about human technology? There we go. Thank you. Okay, let's see here. All right, these are, a lot of these photographs that I'm going to show you are in no particular order, but I'm just going to go down through them, and as I get to each one, I'll explain what they are and what bearing they had on the mill and its construction. In about 1790, Noah Thompson came here and built a grist mill. And it had, I don't know the exact, how many people it took to build it, but it was no small undertaking. It was a group of men that worked real hard. They had a common goal, and they worked together, and they went forward, and they did a beautiful job on it. And a lot, you know, even though it's through the elements, you know, and fire has been gone, a lot of the workmanship that they did survives to this time. That was in 1790, and they built a dam across the Oriskany Creek. All right. They built a dam across the Oriskany Creek. It went from, if you went right straight down to the end of Maple Street and stopped, the dam started there and went right straight across the Oriskany Creek. It was a wooden dam, and it was what they call a gravity dam. They drove pilings down into the riverbed, into the floodplain, and covered them with stone, and then they put more pilings against them to prop up other pilings that they put wooden sheathing, wooden decking at. And they had wooden sheathing on the downstream side of it, so that wouldn't, as the water came over it and spilled and went down the other side of it, it wouldn't erode it and tear it all up every year. The idea of a gravity dam was that it had a long base and a low angle that went up, and then it dropped off on a spillway. And the weight of the water that covered that long approach held the dam in place. You couldn't wash one out. They had to rot down or be breached. And these logs indicate that the natural timber in the area was used to build a framework for this gravity dam. They were notched like this. These were done with an axe. This is a piece of elm. They were barked first. They laid the log out, say probably 10 feet long, chopped down one side of it with an axe, chopped 3 rings all the way around it, and then took the bark off these live elm trees and used them for shingles on the mill. It was something they had learned from the Native Americans that lived here that used elm shingles on their longhouses.
I'll get it.
You get it next. Okay, like I say, in no particular order. This is part of one of Clark's millstones. He had 2 run of stones, at least. We know that for one good reason is that the radius of the outside of this stone, going back to the center, there are 2 different radii of stone that we found up there. One's about 5 feet, one's about almost 6 feet. And this one here is a little over 5 feet. That's a runner stone. And it's upside down. You're looking at the bottom face of it now. It would have been flipped over and run around like this. And it weighs, I don't know, 1.5 tons probably. And it moved at 120 RPM. 5 feet in diameter stone, 120 RPM. That's huge to me. I don't know.
Wow.
How'd you like to get hit with that? The center is rounded out, and then there's a cross cut in it. That cross supported an iron structure called a damsel. It was a bow that went like this with 4 arms on it, a double bow, and it was perched on a shaft. That damsel allowed the stone to rock like a gimbal mount in all directions. And as the stone spun around, you could move it like this. You could adjust the grind of the grain with the angle that you placed on it, the tension that you placed on it, how close to the other stone that it was. The next one, that little stone on top, go back that. That little stone on top of there, right there, is the one that's over here on the table. That's a very important stone, and I'll tell you why when we get to it. But there were probably 100 of those that were stuck together in a plaster bed that were upside down like this, that stone sat on top of it and rotated. That's just one of them. Okay, next. This is a piece where the bark was taken off of those trees, the green trees, the green elm. It was ringed all the way around, just of an axe, every 4 feet. And then they'd strip the bark off, they'd go longitudinally on 2 sides, and they'd take half the log on each side of those rings. Next. And this is one of the notches that there were a lot of compound notches. There's one here, it's obvious, and then there's a point that fits into another notch on the end of that. And on following the end of this log, there's a double notch, 2 different directions. So it was complex framework. This was part of the gravity dam. Next. This little guy, this little hole in the stone, in the millstone, is very important. They had a tool that was like an ice pick, right? Ice tongs. And they bring it, clamp it, and you go in each one in each side of the holes of that stone. They lift it up with a crane, just a little bit, and they'd swing it out with an arm, flip it over like that, set it on another bed. And then a stone sharpener, a millstone sharpener. There was itinerant guys that went around sharpening millstones. Would come in with little hammers and little chisels, and they'd sharpen that stone, all the little grooves in the stone. You see the bedding grooves on the top of it there. They'd sharpen all of those. And when you see how sharp some of these are, you'll be amazed. Okay, next. These are some of this is a roughing stone, a runner stone. And there was 2 types of grooves on the stones. There were the runner stones, had smooth, small grooves on them. And then there were the roughing stones, and they had big grooves on them. And they were in different directions. Some were sickle dressed, like this. Some were triangular, dressed with big, thick, deep grooves on them. And they would roll and crack the grain as it went around. And that damsel would be lowered, and the runner stone would get smoother to those. And it turned the cracked corn into meal, then into fines, then into flour after that. That's just another picture. I was trying to just adjust the sunlight a little bit on it so that you can see how fine some of the lines and striations on it were on the runner stone. That's a stone that was over 6 feet in diameter and weighed close to 2 tons. And that's just a little piece of it. I remember when that stone was found, it was absolutely beautiful. It was a tremendous stone. And it was found right up by the end of the driveway. I wasn't the one that found it. Somebody else found it and decided that it would look real good in their lawn on the end of their swimming pool. And couldn't move it. They had everything under the sun hooked to it and they couldn't move the damn thing. So they went after it with sledgehammers and broke it into little pieces and thought they'd reassemble it when they got it there. And it just stayed in the pile and then they dumped it over the bank. And it was magnificent. And that's a piece from over the bank that I salvaged. Okay, next. That's just another sample of the notching. This steep end was cut with a saw, and this was done with an axe. And the part in the chisel was done with what they call a spud, or a broad chisel, a hewing chisel. Next. Okay, this is where the damsel sat in, upside down. You can see where it was roughed out, the 4 notches were roughed out. The damsel was seated in those iron cups, and then lead was poured around them. So there was a perfect fit. That lead took up the space, so that it was just absolutely perfect fit, no vibration for the damsel. And it was a very efficient way of getting to an accurate measurement without spending, a lifetime of chiseling and scraping to do it. Next. This again is some of the axe marks that went all the way around these logs. Incidentally, these logs washed up in the flood of a couple of years ago. They came from underneath the bottom of the stone spillway. These were the framers from underneath it. So they went in before the stone spillway was laid up, and the stone spillway was laid up in 1790. So these have been in the ground since that time and underwater, and they're in remarkably good condition still. Next. And again. All right. This is just to show you how accurately this little stone fit on there. There were rows of them that they went in concentric circles into the center of the stone. They were laid in a bed of plaster. That was the base of the mill. Next. This is a decking board for the dam. We found a couple of them down there. They're 2 inches thick, they're about 14 inches wide, and they're cut with several of these square holes in them that were put in by the chisel. Next. I don't know how that got in there, but sooner or later we'll get back to the decking boards. This was, we're taking this sycamore tree down. It's myself and Curly McDonough. It was when we started the excavation, you can see the lower wall here, down at the bottom, the lower stone wall. That tree had to come down and out of there so that we could get purchase to get back in and see what the hell we were working with. It was a shame to take it down, but it had to come out. So it's gone. Next. You'll see why in a minute. It had to come out. Next. That's the tree. That's right where the stump of it was. We dropped it right in here. These are limbs from it. Right at the base of that tree is the wheel pit for the sawmill. There was a pit there that's 16 feet deep and 10 feet wide. And that was the diameter and width of the wheel that sat in it.
And we dug it all out.
That's right.
Oh my goodness.
You'll see. A lot of it came out of there with shovels and a trowel. It was a huge pit, but it's remarkably interesting when you get into it. Next. This is looking at, I don't even know where the hell I'm looking now. All right, yeah, I do. That's just looking at it over across it where the trunk of the tree was up there. Next. And this is looking at it again. If you see the end of those logs, you'll see where there's a little road that goes up over the top of that. Right there. Just on this side of it and to the right down in that pit, that's the wheel pit. That's where the water wheels sat. The water to serve the mill came down from, you can see the upper mill up at the end of the canal there. Well, right there. The water came down from there. It split right at the top of that. And it came over here onto the left-hand side, if you see that lower stone wall? On the left-hand side, a little more to the left, more to the left, down. Right there, that lower stone wall was part of a viaduct. The water went through that and came down through this canal here and served this mill down here. And this is where it split and the sawmill portion of it was taken off. The grist mill portion was taken off up above and it was added back into this canal for the sawmill. The part that wasn't used went through what they call a dive culvert. It was a stone tunnel that dove down underneath the bed of this canal. It came out went over into the creek there. In 1943, it was rebuilt and there was a concrete wall that went up there. The dive culvert had been collapsed before that. In 1914, they did some concrete work there. In 43, they did some more. Your dad worked on it in the summertime of 1943, and his initials are in the cement up there.
That's nice.
Not even- Anyhow, this mill was buried in about 1890, between 1890 and 1900. Arthur Hine deemed it more important that all the water be sent down to run the plush mill than use any of it on the sawmill. So he crushed it down and they buried it. And when they buried it, they had to make it watertight and waterproof and make sure that none of the water that came through this canal could ever leak out and wash it out here. And as we go along, I'll show you what they did just toward that end. Okay, next one. This is looking up into the water wheel pit. You see that? There's the sycamore stump. There's a high stone wall right across from it. The top of the wheel went right to about the top of that stone wall there. And this would have been the discharge area. As we got down a lot deeper than that. Got right down to the base of that, another 8 feet in there. And that was where the water discharged, went down, went back into the Oriskany Creek. It had a total drop of about 10 feet. And the reason it wasn't 16 feet is because it was a breast height wheel. The water didn't hit the wheel and come over the top. It hit the wheel and turned the wheel backwards this way. Next. This is where the water would come out right out of that gully and flash right out at us here. Next. That structure that you see going across there is the dam and water height control for the water wheel. The height of that stopped any water. It built up head pressure up to the height of that wall and just drizzled over the top of that wall. But there was a slot cut in the wall at an angle that came down through the wall. It was only probably a 6-inch slot, but it had 4 feet of head pressure behind it, and it was 10 feet wide. And that's a hell of a lot of power coming through a 6-inch hole 10 feet wide. And it hit the wheel right square, right smack on, and dropped down through and drove it. It must have been really something to watch. Next. But as you can see, we're digging that water exit channel out now. This is as we're going. Okay, next. This is getting down to, this is that wall, this is what it looks like, and you see what we're using for tools to dig with. A little trowel and little shovels and stuff. We're not down to the slot yet where the water comes through, but we will be after a while. And all this stuff is, we took hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of photographs, just hundreds of them, loaded them all up into the computer, and then we got ransomware. So we lost them all.
Oh.
We took, measurements and drew maps, and the whole thing is gone.
Oh.
But we were able to save these, and some other ones I have too, but not all the ones that I really wanted to keep. Okay, next one. This is going down to the bottom of the pit, and that's where those 2 iron bars are. They ran right along the side of the water mill. As the wheel turned this way, there's 2 iron bars on each side. What they were for, I don't know. But you can see up about the middle of this where that slot is. We'll get a better view of it in a minute. Next. Yeah, try to.
That's a two steel.
Yeah. Oh, this is the upstream side. Okay. Go to the next frame. All right. This is just a side of the, where the mill was pushed in to keep it from ever leaking water. They crushed the whole mill in on the side, pushed it down into the water wheel pit, and that is part of the overburden that stayed in place for a long time. We were very careful about it and dug underneath it. Okay, next slide. This is more of it here. Next slide. More of the same. Next slide. Okay. That's still the upstream slide. Go a couple more, Molly. All right, here we go. Now this is at the very bottom of the upstream side. They wanted to make sure no water would ever go through there. It's stuff that you see in the corner that looks like cement. Well, it's not. It's fly ash. They used to take the fly ash years ago from coal burning fires, coal burning stoves in the factories. And when you threw it in water, if there was a leak in the water, it would migrate to that leak and it would stop it. And they put about 6 inches of fly ash all over the upstream side of this mill so that there would never ever be a leak anywhere and to let the water back out. Because Arthur Hine didn't want to waste a drop of it to get to his precious mill. But that's fly ash, the stuff that looks like concrete. Okay, next. A little more, another one. All right, this is a layer that's underneath the fly ash. Those are cedar shingles, stacks of them about that thick. They were driven into the water slot to stop it, and then it coated with fly ash. He wasn't going to take any chances. You can see the cedar shingles underneath there. Next. Those are cedar shingles under the fly ash. Next. There they are closer up. And there were a lot of them. There were, like I said, they were driven in a thick layer. And once everything is pulled out of there, and the water valve is open. So next. Next. Next, it's not open yet, it took a while. Okay, that's the inside. That's the downstream side. That's where the water came out and hit the wheel right on the face. Water came flying through that slot right there. This was an ingenious method because it guaranteed that the water height was always the same. Therefore, the head pressure was always the same. Therefore, the wheel always turned at exactly the same RPM. And you could tune the saw that way. You knew exactly what you were going to get or what you weren't going to get. And you weren't worried about dynamic fluctuations in the water level. Okay, next. See, I can turn in both directions and dig with a trowel. This is going the other way, and like I say, we had to pull all that out of there. I'm still not to the bottom. I'm standing on still dirt there. We got down to the bottom of it finally, and boy, I'll tell you, it went way down. Next. We're getting closer to it on this side. This is the downstream side of the wheel. Next. Again, next. Okay, that's almost to the bottom there. You can see where the stone starts to flatten out there, right up towards the base of the wall. There was a little apron there, and that apron sloped away like this as it went to the wall. And what that did was when the water started to spill off of the wheel, it hit that apron and bounced back onto the blades of the wheel and pushed it again so that no power was lost. So you'd have a good constant power. Okay, next. And that's the very bottom of it. And that's showing part of that sloped base there. Next. A little bit more of it. I'm not real imaginative, I just had to record it. All right, next. These two iron rods, don't know what they were for. They're still a mystery to me. And I don't know what the little square notch there was for either. That really bugs me. But that's laid up in stone that way, and there's I don't know, I just don't know what that was for, what the reason behind it was, but I'm sure there had to be a good reason, or they wouldn't have done it, spent the work. Okay, next. 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 Most of these are just redundant photographs, but I wanted to make sure I didn't miss anything to record it. You can see that that notch is just about that wide. Next. And that's the legend. They did beautiful stonework. Okay. When Arthur Hind closed the sawmill down, he buried everything. He plugged everything up. And he filled in the top of the mill. And what didn't fill in, he used as a garbage dump. And Copeland lived in the house after Arthur Hind did. And he used it as a garbage dump too. And when we excavated, went down through the top of the garbage dump to get into the wheel pit, we came out with thousands and thousands of bottles and jars of English mustard and these little liquor jars. What do they call them? U-mix-its?
Yep.
They had a a little shot inside like a little shooter glass inside of a bottle. And apparently, you opened the top one, poured it in the glass, and then you took the inside one and poured that in, and when it was like a shooter. I didn't know what the hell they were. There were thousands of them. We saved a bunch of them. But that's, guess what Arthur Hind was drinking at the time? But the whole pit was full of liquor bottles. It was, I don't think they ate anything. But this jar of olives was in there. And God knows when it went in, but it went in long before the war. It went in the early 1900s. And it was still sealed. We got laughing about it. We were thinking about opening the jar to see if the olives were still good. I mean, my camera isn't great with color, but the damn things looked really good. They looked like you could still eat them. Not that I'm much for that, but. So I let them go. Okay, next. This is a curling stone. We found that in our diggings. And I wrote a little article about it for Shirley. And it was, we don't know if it was Arthur Hind's curling stone or not, but it was right at the end where I showed you where that sawmill dam went across, the upstream side of that. It would have been just upstream from the water gate. My supposition is that he used to go down on the ice on Saturday mornings and play with that curling stone, get a little practice on the team. And he hit the water gate. Well, the ice next to the water gate is always very, very thin. It freezes right up to the water gate, but when you get right to it, it thins right up to nothing like a razor blade. And I think he went through the ice there and lost his stone. So we found it, and the construction is real interesting. The handle turns backwards and comes out. It's threaded in through the top piece into the bottom piece. And there was 1 3/4 of English oak between the two of them. And the reason we know it was English oak is the grain pattern that was left from the rotted wood between the two stones. We were able to lift the pattern of the grain and compare it, and it was English oak. So which was pretty cool, I thought. A little forensic detail.
Tell them what you did with it, Noel.
We donated it to the Utica Curling Club, and they put it in their case down there.
Because Clark Mills introduced curling to the United States.
It did. And the most
Welch and
important thing about that dam that went across Clark Mills, across the creek there, wasn't even so much that it ran to Grist Mill, but that was a curling pond up in there. Over to White Street and back of White Street up along French Road.
We had a picture.
Yeah.
Now, they used to curl also where the tax lived down in that swamp.
Yeah.
They curl there because we got a photo, I believe, of it in the archives.
Yeah, well, there's that, up above that gravity dam that went across the creek, there's what they called it the pond. And there was an old map, 1846 maybe, that labeled it the pond, and there was an area on the end of it that was like colored different. And I don't know whether they did it in a straight lane or what the hell.
They used to skate on it, I think, at one time.
Could be. But I think that was the curling run when they slid the stones, I don't know. Anyhow, there's one, that's what they looked like in the 1890s. We tapped a little of the crap off of it, and it was in pretty decent shape underneath. I didn't wanna attack it too hard to get the rust off, because I didn't know how the rest of it would hold up. But anyhow, there it is. If you'd like to see it, you could go down to the Utica Curling Club down here. They'll be glad to talk to you. They're wonderful people down there. It's a real good bunch. And they love the fact that anybody takes an interest in curling. There it is again. And it's sitting on the millstone out here. Okay, next. Again, there's a few views of it in here. There was 3 or 4. But you can see how it was held together with the handle as the attachment. Next. Next. There you go. Next. All right. This is just downstream. This is the spillway, the stone spillway, that the runoff water from the grist mill ran off and went down over these stones so that it wouldn't wash out the base of it. Unfortunately, the base of it got compromised, it washed out, it was torn away. This is the very base of that spillway that was left. This is gone now too after that last flood. Next. That's the base of the dam, of the spillway, of the dam that ran the grist mill. This is the spillway coming over here. The water would come over the top of it this way. And you can see right in the face of it, those wooden columns, those were part of the framework that you see that these logs were that I've been showing you. And there's some sawed wood there too. This goes back into the 1700s, 1790. Those logs weren't huge. Somewhere they were sawing them. I don't know where. But some of the logs that came in were sawed. They may have had a pit saw down here, which is not uncommon. They had pit saws everywhere where they'd dig a big pit, put a trestle across it, lay a log out on top of it, put one guy down in the pit, one guy up above. The guy up above would stand there and pull the saw, and the guy in the bottom of the pit would pull the saw the other way. And they just walk down through a log like that and split it. And I think that's where the expression "in the pits" came from. I don't know, but it had to suck being down there. Okay, next. These are some logs right here that were driven into the base of the floodplain. That's the end of one of them right there. It was part of the gravity dam. So the gravity dam would have run this way if you're looking on the end of the log. Next. There's 3 more. See how they're driven in? Those are driven right into the base of the floodplain. They're still down there. Some of them are in decent condition. We took one out that was washed up in the flood, and we sawed it on the sawmill in the 1-inch boards. And the wood is sound. I mean, it's not great. It's a little, got degrade in it, but there's beautiful color in it. The colors in it are beautiful, and I think that's from the minerals in the water that's been underwater for 200 and some years. But like I said, there's the base of the dam that built Clark Mills right there. Okay, next. There's another one of them. Next. And you can see them down in and along here, along into the bank, sticking out of the bank on the end there. Next, and then if you keep going, looking right straight down that little creek bed, you go to Roses and right up on White Street. This is one of those planks that was a decking plank off of that dam. Next. There's another one there. See the wooden spikes in it? Those are square wooden spikes that held that decking. They drive them in with a tapered wooden spike, and they drive them into the logs underneath them. Next. This is some of the complex notching. Next. Oh, that's a roughing pattern on a roughing millstone. This was another of the millstones that I found in the creek. I carried this piece up out of the creek. It was the last heavy thing I think I ever carried. When I got it up, I couldn't throw it down. it's probably that wide, like this, only about that thick. But you can see the distinct roughing pattern on them. In the old days, when they cut one of these, they cut them in 4 or 5 different rows, notches or grooves. The first one would be the master, the second one would be the journeyman, the third one would be the apprentice, and the fourth one would be the slave. Those were the names of the grooves that they gave to the grooves. And it was a contemporary type of cut. Okay, next. There's some more notching that's complex. And you can notice, even though this is done with an axe, some is with a saw, and some is with a spud, that's pretty damn accurate cut. That's a real nice cut. Next. There's that silly millstone again. But you can see the hole on this side, which was opposite the one I showed you before, where the gantry picked up, looked like a pair of ice tunnels. It came down, went into the stone, lifted it up, moved it. Okay, next. There's some more barking rings. Next. This is another pattern on that millstone and the roughing stone. Next. Okay, next. This is that millstone, and that's what it looks like with 3 feet of snow on it. So if you've forgotten, okay, next. All right, this is right out of the creek, right off of the bottom of that dam. I don't know how this particular member featured into the construction, but it's. When I get some more drawings, I'll figure it out. Okay, next. 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 Oh wait, go back to that one, Mo. You see right in the center of that notch, going back that way and coming up this way. That notch right there, over there. A little more, a little more. All right, Donald, do you see that axe notch? That's axe cut there. There's another one here, over on this end. Those were continuous lines that went all the way down the length of the log where the bark was split this way, when they take it off in 4-foot sections. And the log that we sawed, we got one up by the sawmill up there. It's beautiful. You put it back together and you can see the deliberate, just exactly how it was ringed and how it was cut and removed. Next. There's another one these are a couple of the planks, decking planks for the dam. They're 2 inches thick. They're about 12 or 14 inches wide. I think they may be hemlock. I'm not sure. Next. You're going backwards. Next. Next. Okay, that, and I'll show you at the end here on the little stone. This is the face of the little stone. See those little tiny marks in it, the little stripes? It's hard to believe they're wider than a knife blade. I mean, you could almost run a razor blade down through them. They're that fine. And they were put in there with a hammer. A guy stood there with a hammer with a little sharp edge on it that went this way and went like this. He went like that forever. I saw a guy dress a stone at Hanford Mills one time. He was a stone dresser and he had all the original tools. And they had a stone laid out there that they had and were in need of having dressed. And you could put your hand over the part that was dull. It was smooth. And when you put your hand, and he'd stand there with that little hammer like that and just go very, very lightly. You never hit it like that. Just touch it. And he'd put those little lines in there. And when he got all done, it made, when it was dull, you'd roll the corn, or you'd roll the wheat, or roll the oats. You couldn't get them to grind. But when you sharpen one, boom, it'd be right down to finest flour, because the stone was sharp. And once it started rolling or beating the meal, that's when you had to go have it sharpened. And you could feel the difference. One was smooth, and when you got done touching the side, he just dressed. It was like, I don't wanna say Velcro, but it was like, it'd hold your hand would drag on it. It was like, a little like sandpaper, but you couldn't see it, and you couldn't tell the difference in it. But it grind, I imagine. Next.
That's it.
That's it. Okay, that's pretty much all I got then, except that, there's a tremendous more stuff that's down there, and we had a lot more. We'll be getting a lot more and more information. It's a project that I'm gonna keep on afterward. And, a couple of things I wanted to say, just in closing. This is the dressed side of that little piece of millstone that was up there so that you can get a good look at it. There's a picture here of a guy named Manchester who was a Clark Mills resident, and he worked for the mill here. And he's sitting on top of one of the water wheels. We think it was the Grist Mill water wheel that was behind the house. That too was an undershot wheel at the time this picture was taken. So a lot of mills went through 3 or 4 different kinds of wheels in their time. And a lot of them then, later on, ended up with turbines with vertical shafts and horizontal wheels, because they were more efficient. They could run on less of a head of water. This is the part I really think is incredible, though. This piece of wood, one of the logs in there had just a sawed end on it. That's because I sawed the very end of it off. And the ring pattern on this is so tight that you can see the indications of the Little Ice Age in Europe. This log went into the water, down under the water in 1790 when the dam was built. By counting backwards the rings, it goes back to 1475, before Columbus came here. And a lot of the rings in here, I left a magnifying glass here so that you can look at them. A lot of the rings are closer than the grooves in a phonograph needle. So you'll really need that to get a good look at it. But there it is.
The rings in these logs varied with the growth pattern, and sometimes that depended on the weather, didn't it? The climate?
Yes, it did. And there's a section of that shows, like I say, the Little Ice Age that occurred in Europe and occurred here at the same time. It was a global event.
Would they get wider or narrower?
They're getting narrower.
Narrower,
Yeah.
because there wasn't as much growth.
Yeah, and there's a space there for about 100 years that you can't even, it's like that. So, and it's reflective of the time, the same time, the 1500s, that the Little Ice Age caused the potato famine in the 1600s and 1700s, and caused mass starvation, caused the second shot of the bubonic plague, all of that, and it's recorded in those growth rates. So you actually can see the history. That's all I got. I wish to thank everybody very much for putting up with it. If you've got any questions, I'll be glad to stay and answer anything I could. Teresa?
What years did you do all this digging?
In 2010, I think, we found, on January 1st, 2010, I think, we found the sawmill. I had done some digging up at the grist mill before that, but I hadn't done any digging, gotten into the wood, because we hadn't had the flood, we hadn't had the washout. There wasn't any reason to get in there and start, tearing down through to pull timber out, because everything was in place. Matter of fact, it was working. So we were using the mill at the time.
Are there any photos? You said there's some photos in the mill?
There's some drawings of where the mill sat, and no photos of the grist mill. And I've not been able to find any photos of the sawmill, but it shows up on maps. And on one particular map, I don't know whether there's one here, there's usually a map of Clark Mills hanging around town here somewhere. You'll see that there's right behind the house there, the creek goes down, then it stops. And you go down a little farther and it starts again. That's where it went underwater into that viaduct.
Yeah.
It was underground. It was underground for 120 feet. And it shows up on the maps. And all the dive culverts show up on the maps as, they start as a water course and then they stop. And they come up over here, go downstream again. Anybody else? Anything? Yep.
Did you have to visit other places to know what you were looking at? I mean, I looked at that, I'd be walking through my woods, I'd say, oh, that's a log.
I've studied this most of my life.
Oh, okay.
You know, there was always a lot of history here in Clark Mills that I thought was pretty fascinating, and we've always tried to preserve it. And history in Clark Mills goes back a minimum of 10,000 years. There were people here that were living here 10,000 years ago, and we've looked at some of the places that they lived. And we found a site here, or I did, in 1973 or 74, and collected on it and studied it and generated a paper with the State Education Department. And it became a premier presentation at the Eastern States Archaeological Federation up in Salem, Mass. And we went up there to give the paper. And it was pretty fascinating. And it's like its own well-kept little secret, so nobody knows,
What,
doesn't do it.
there are obviously, Native Americans, I would think.
No, these were Chinese.
Really?
What the hell do you think?
No, I mean, what, you don't
Yes,
know,
the
we didn't give you a chance with the follow-up.
Yeah.
You know what?
They were here before Columbus.
So, yeah, what tribes, or do you know the name of them?
There were no, at that point in time, as far as anybody knows, there were no organized tribes. These were bands of people that traveled and followed the herds. They were your hunter-gatherers. They didn't stay in one space, in one place, but they came back to the same places every year where they'd had good luck. And they followed the herds of, we used to have reindeer here, we used to have bison here, wild horses. In fact, there were wild horses here on this continent before the Indians killed them all off. And the white man had to reintroduce horses because the Indians had never seen them. Well, they'd seen them before, but they killed them all.
Yeah.
Apparently they were tasty. I don't know. But the paper that we were able to generate and the artifacts that we were able to collect and examine showed a really tremendous resolve for these people who had nothing but a couple of little stones, and that's what they made their living with. Just nothing at all. And I don't know how the hell they stayed alive. I'm sorry, what?
Tell them where they are,
Tell them where,
Albany.
oh, if you go down to Albany and you go into that funny looking building they got down there, it looks like a big football.
The eggs.
Yeah, if you go in there, you'll find them on display in the Paleo-Indian section of the Natural History Museum. You won't find all of them, but if you know which ones you're looking at, you'll know that they were the ones that came from here in Clark Mills. I donated 1,400 pieces to the State Education Department. Every once in a while, I dust back over and I pick up a few more and I catalog them. I haven't sent them in yet, but I have some at the house, and if I do a talk on those, I'll bring them up here and show them to you. But these people had just nothing but their hands and feet and whatever they could grab and put over their bodies to stay warm. You know, they didn't stay here in the winter, I'll tell you that. They followed the reindeer south. So, anybody else? Yes, sir.
The transportation of these stones and the manufacturing to get them round, and where did they come from originally? You got a...
The millstones? The millstones?
Yeah, the millstones.
Yeah, a lot of the millstones, not a lot, not all, but many of them were quarried in France. And they were sent to this country as ballast in ships, on board ships, to keep the weight. And when they got here, they offloaded the millstones. Same way they used to send just ballast stone. If you go to Savannah, Georgia, the cotton ships that used to go between Georgia and England and back and forth, They used to go dump their cotton in England, load up with a bunch of stone off of the beach, just for ballast. They were in a hurry to get back and get cotton. When they got back to Savannah, they threw all the stones out because they wanted to take everything that they could back, and they put other stuff in the hold for ballast. A lot of the buildings along the waterfront down there are built with the corners are made of brick, and the rest of the building is ballast stone. And when you get to a corner where you need a square, it's made out of brick again. And the whole riverfront street there, River Street, a lot of those buildings are that style. There was a, it's named for a guy that said, look at, we're being buried under all these friggin' ballast stones. Can't we do something with them? How about this? And he had the idea of squaring corners and filling them in with ballast stones. But many of them were mined in France. They're it's a high-grade conglomerate, very, very sharp, with, and some are quartzite. This one over here comes from France, this little piece of it. This is a French burr. And they were selected just for their hardness, so when you got a good edge on them, it would hold it for a long, long time.
There's a lot of sandstone in this area, isn't there?
There is, there's the
That's pretty
United,
fragile.
yeah, the United Sandstone and the United Conglomerate too, which looks much like this stuff, the United Conglomerate, but it's not nearly as strong. You're right, it's the chemistry of the silicate that binds the grains of sand together and the carbonates that bind it to make the natural cement aren't anywhere near as strong as the stuff that there is in France. The mechanism that the conglomerate was made by, the type of deposition was different, and the percolation of water through it was different. The chemical constituents were different. It made their stuff harder than hell, and ours is, substantial. We use it as a building stone, but it's not a good millstone. And you see a lot, by the way, in your travels, you'll see a lot of these big round limestone stones with a round hole in the middle of them. Those aren't millstones. Those are a blacksmith's stone. For a wheelwright, they put the hub of the wheel in the center of the hole, lay the spokes out, put the rim together, and then drive the tire on, and bang it on that stone until it was straight. When the steel rim on the stone was called a tire. That's what those big round stones were used for. They weren't a millstone.
There's an operating grist mill with a wheel, and the whole 9 yards, only the wheel goes off, as the water comes off the top
Mhm.
to feed the water wheel.
Right.
And that's in Sudbury. I don't know if you've ever been there, at the Wayside Inn. And they actually make flour there that you can buy
Yeah.
in the inn.
We've been to that one in Hanford Mills.
Yeah.
They've got a Fitz wheel, 12-foot overshot wheel, wide wheel. They got a whole factory that runs off line shaft off of that wheel.
Is it water driven off?
Yes. Yeah. Anybody else? Well, I want to thank you all very much for having me, and like I said, I want to thank Virginia and Moses, my wife, for putting up with the mess that I drag in the house most of the time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.